On March 23, 1994, a 15-year-old boy sat in the captain's seat of an Airbus A310, 35,000 feet above Siberia. His hands were on the control stick. His father, the actual pilot, stood behind him, smiling. And for 11 minutes, nobody noticed that the plane was slowly banking to the right. By the time they figured it out, 75 people had less than 60 seconds to live. This isn't a story about terrorism or mechanical failure. It's about something far more unsettling. Because what brought down Aeroflot Flight 593 was pride over confidence, and the kind of decision that makes you think, what were they thinking? Keep watching and find out. The Airbus A310 is a workhorse. Reliable, sophisticated, and in 1994, relatively new to Russian aviation. Aeroflot had just started flying them, transitioning from Soviet-era aircraft that required brute force and constant attention to these sleek, computer-assisted Western machines. The A310 didn't just fly, it thought for you. Autopilot handled most of the work. Fly-by-wire systems interpreted your commands and smoothed them out. For pilots trained on old Soviet aircraft where you fought the controls every second, this was a culture shock. Captain Andrei Viktorovich Danilov was one of these pilots. Experienced, respected, with thousands of hours in the air. He was exactly who you'd want flying your plane across the vast emptiness of Siberia. His son, Eldar, was 15. His daughter, Yana, was 12. And on this particular night, they were in the cockpit. Now, before you start thinking this was some rogue operation, you need to understand something about Russian aviation culture in the 1990s. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. Rules were suggestions. Aeroflot was transitioning from a state-run monopoly to something resembling a normal airline. But the culture lagged behind. Letting family members into the cockpit wasn't just common. It was expected. A perk of the job. Show your kids where dad works. Let them sit in the seat. Take a photo. What's the harm? Flight 593 took off from Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport at 9:34 p.m., bound for Hong Kong. 75 people on board. 12 crew members. 63 passengers. The flight plan was straightforward. Over Siberia, through Mongolian airspace, and down into Hong Kong. About 6 hours of flying over some of the most remote, unforgiving terrain on the planet. The kind of place where if something goes wrong, help isn't coming quickly. For the first 3 hours, everything was routine. The autopilot was engaged. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. Captain Danilov's children had been in the cockpit for a while now, watching their father work. Yana, the 12-year-old daughter, went first. She sat in the captain's seat. The crew adjusted the seat height so she could reach the controls. They let her hold the control stick. Nothing too crazy. Just enough to feel like she was flying. Her father stood behind her, coaching, explaining. The autopilot stayed engaged the entire time. The plane continued on its programmed route. Everyone was happy. Then it was Eldar's turn. 15 years old. Probably feeling like he needed to one-up his little sister. He sat in the captain's seat. Again, the crew adjusted everything. Made him comfortable. The first officer, Igor Piskaryov, was in the right seat. Captain Danilov stood behind his son. The relief pilot, Yaroslav Kudrinsky, was also in the cockpit. 3 experienced pilots, 1 teenager, and a plane flying itself. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting I mean catastrophic. Eldar wasn't just holding the control stick, he was moving it. Banking left and right, feeling the resistance. The weight of it. And his father was encouraging him. See? You're controlling it. You're turning the plane. Except he wasn't. The autopilot was still engaged. When the autopilot is on, the control stick can move all it wants. The plane ignores it. It's like turning the steering wheel of a parked car. Feels real, does nothing. But there's a catch. And it's a big one. The Airbus A310's autopilot has a feature. If the control stick is moved with enough force for a sustained period of time, the autopilot begins to disengage. Not all at once, not with a loud alarm. Gradually, silently, the plane interprets this as the pilot wanting to take manual control. So it steps back, lets the human take over. Slowly, Eldar held the control stick in a slight bank to the right for about 30 seconds. Not aggressively, just enough. and the autopilot's lateral control, the part that keeps the wings level, partially disengaged. The plane started banking right, slowly, less than 2 degrees. Nobody noticed. Why would they? The autopilot was still on. Or so they thought. The bank continued. 3 degrees, 5 degrees, 10 degrees. The plane was now in a noticeable turn, but because it was so gradual, and because they were over pitch black Siberia at night, with no visual references, it felt normal. The instruments showed the bank, but the crew wasn't watching them. They were watching a kid play pilot. By the time someone noticed, the plane was banked at 20 degrees. That's not a gentle turn. That's a committed maneuver. The autopilot was fighting to correct it, but only partially. It was confused. Half engaged, half disengaged. The plane was descending, not dramatically, just a couple 100 feet. Captain Danilov finally looked at the instruments. Something was wrong. He told Eldar to get out of the seat. Piskaryov took control. But here's the problem. Nobody realized the autopilot had partially disengaged. They thought it was still fully engaged. So when Piskaryov tried to correct the bank, he was expecting the autopilot to help. It didn't. 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The G-forces built up. Passengers felt the tilt. Bags slid across the cabin. People started to realize something was very wrong. In the cockpit, alarms began sounding. Not the "hey, pay attention" kind. The "you're about to die" kind. The plane reached 45 degrees of bank. That's halfway to being completely sideways. At this angle, the wings aren't generating lift efficiently. They're just dragging the plane through the air. The nose dropped. The plane started descending faster, 1,500 feet per minute, then 2,000, then 3,000. Piskaryov pulled back on the control stick, trying to level the wings, trying to stop the descent. But the plane wasn't responding the way he expected, because the autopilot wasn't helping. He was flying manually without realizing it, and he was overcorrecting. The bank increased. 50 degrees, 60 degrees. The plane was now in a spiral dive. The nose dropped further. The airspeed increased. 400 knots, 450 knots. The plane was screaming toward the earth, spinning as it fell. The cockpit voice recorder captured everything. Shouting. Alarms. The sound of the control stick being yanked back. And then, a moment of pure horror. The plane rolled past 90 degrees. It was upside down, completely inverted, 35,000 feet above Siberia. Passengers were hanging from their seatbelts. Loose objects flew through the cabin. The G-forces were crushing. Piskaryov kept pulling back on the stick, but when you're inverted, pulling back doesn't make you climb. It makes you dive faster. The plane's nose pointed almost straight down. The altimeter unwound like a slot machine. 30,000 feet, 25,000 feet, 20,000 feet. They were falling at over 20,000 feet per minute. He shoved Eldar out of the way, tried to take control, but it was chaos. 3 people fighting for the controls. Alarms screaming. The plane shaking violently. The autopilot was fully disengaged now. Everything was manual. And nobody had a clear picture of what was happening. At 15,000 feet, something miraculous happened. Piskaryov and Danilov, pulling with everything they had, managed to level the wings. The plane was still diving, but it was right side up. For a moment, it looked like they might pull out of it. But they were going too fast. Over 500 knots. The plane wasn't designed for that kind of speed at low altitude. The controls were sluggish, fighting against the aerodynamic forces. They were at 10,000 feet now, still diving, still too fast. Piskaryov pulled back harder. The nose started to rise. The G-forces built up again. 2 Gs, 3 Gs. The plane was groaning, the airframe stressed beyond its limits. But the nose kept rising. 4,000 feet, 3,000 feet. The ground was rushing up. They were seconds away from impact. And then the worst possible thing happened. They overcorrected. The nose rose too quickly. The plane pitched up violently. 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees. The airspeed bled off. The plane stalled. The wings stopped generating lift. They were falling again. Nose down. No altitude left to recover. At 12:23 a.m., Flight 593 hit the ground in a remote forest in Kemerovo Oblast, Siberia. The impact was catastrophic. The plane disintegrated on contact. All 75 people on board were killed instantly. The wreckage scattered across 2 miles of frozen wilderness. Investigators wouldn't reach the site for days. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were buried in the snow, but they survived. And they told the whole story. The investigation revealed something that shocked the aviation world. Not just that children had been allowed in the cockpit. Not just that they'd been allowed to sit in the captain's seat, but that the crew had no idea the autopilot had disengaged. They flew for 11 minutes with partial manual control without realizing it. And when things went wrong, they didn't understand what the plane was doing. Here's the technical breakdown. The Airbus A310's autopilot has different modes. Full autopilot, heading hold, altitude hold. When Eldar applied pressure to the control stick, he inadvertently disengaged the lateral channel. The plane stopped following its programmed heading. It started drifting right, following the control inputs. So the plane tried to maintain altitude while banking, which is impossible. Eventually, the altitude hold gave up too, and the plane was fully manual. The crew should have noticed. There were warnings, subtle ones. A change in the autopilot annunciator lights. A slight difference in the control feel, but they weren't looking. They were focused on the kid in the seat. And when they finally noticed the bank, they assumed it was an autopilot malfunction. They tried to correct it while still assuming the autopilot was helping them. It wasn't. The recovery was almost successful. If they'd had another 1,000 feet of altitude, they might have made it. But they didn't. And the overcorrection at the end, the violent pitch-up that led to the stall, was the result of pure panic. They pulled too hard. The plane responded too slowly. The aftermath was brutal. Aeroflot's reputation, already shaky after the Soviet collapse, took another hit. Regulations changed. Cockpit access was restricted. Training programs were overhauled. The incident became a case study in every aviation safety course. How not to fly a plane. How overconfidence kills. How even experienced pilots can lose situational awareness when they're not paying attention. But here's what really sticks with you. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't even gross incompetence. It was a father wanting to show his kids something cool. It was pilots who'd been doing this for years, letting their guard down for a few minutes. It was a series of small decisions, none of which seemed dangerous at the time, that compounded into disaster. Captain Danilov wasn't a bad pilot. He was experienced, capable. But he made a choice. Let the kids in. Let them touch the controls. Assume the autopilot would catch any problems. And when things went wrong, he fought like hell to fix it. He almost succeeded. The fact that they nearly recovered from a fully inverted spiral dive at 35,000 feet is a testament to their skill, but almost doesn't cut it at 3,000 feet above the ground. The passengers never knew what hit them. One moment they're settling in for a long flight. Maybe reading, sleeping, thinking about Hong Kong. The plane tilting, dropping, rolling. And then nothing. The flight attendants tried to keep people calm, but what do you say when the plane is upside down? When you can feel the G-forces crushing you into your seat, deep down, that this isn't going to end well. 75 people. Gone. Because a 15-year-old wanted to feel what it was like to fly a plane. Because his father wanted to be a hero to his kids. Because a crew assumed the technology would protect them. It's the kind of tragedy that makes you angry and sad at the same time. Angry because it was so preventable. Sad because you understand the impulse behind it. The wreckage site in Siberia is still there, scattered pieces of the A310, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. There's no memorial, no marker, just a remote patch of woods where 75 lives ended in a fraction of a second. The cockpit voice recorder's final sounds are haunting. Alarms. Shouting. The rush of wind, and then silence. Aviation is safer now because of flights like 593. Because investigators picked through the wreckage, analyzed the data, and figured out exactly what went wrong. Because regulators wrote new rules. Because pilots learned the lesson. But it's a lesson written in blood. 75 people paid the price so the rest of us could fly a little bit safer. So the next time you're on a plane and you see that locked cockpit door, remember why it's there. Remember Flight 593. Remember that even the smallest lapse in judgment, even the most innocent decision, can spiral into catastrophe when you're 6 miles above the Earth, moving at 500 miles per hour. The margin for error isn't just thin, it's non-existent. In the end, the Airbus A310 did exactly what it was programmed to do. It followed the inputs it received. It tried to protect itself when things went wrong, but it couldn't account for human nature, for pride, for overconfidence, for the desire to impress your kids. Technology can make flying safer, but it can't make us immune to our own mistakes. That's the real lesson of Aeroflot Flight 593, and it's one we're still learning.